So welcome everyone to today's discussion on methane, possible tipping points or surprises. My name, so I'd like to welcome you. This is the 19th webinar in this discussion series on tipping elements, the notion of irreversibility and abrupt changes in the Earth system. My name is Gabrielle Dreyfus, and I'm the Chief Scientist with the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. And I'd like to welcome you to this discussion series, which is intended to advance knowledge on tipping elements, support efforts to increase consistency in the treatment of tipping elements in the scientific community, develop a research agenda, and design joint experiments and ideas for the tipping element model intercomparison project, TIPMIP. So this is a series that is brought to you by the following networks: the Earth Commission, AIMS, which is the Analysis, Integration, and Modeling of the Earth System project. And both AIMS and the Earth Commission are hosted by Future Earth. This is also part of the Safe Landing Climate's Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program, WCRP. This event is also co-organized by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. So before we jump in and introduce our speakers today, I want to go over a few of the house rules. So the focus for today is on this topic of methane possible tipping points or surprises. Why is methane rising? How are sources and sinks changing? What is the risk from hydrates? Both of our speakers will present, and then we'll go into a Q&A session after they've both presented. During their talks, feel free to pose questions, and it's great if there's a particular speaker that you want your question targeted to. Please indicate that using the Q&A button, which is going to be in the bottom of your Zoom window. So use that Q&A button, and you can vote also. If you see other questions that you would like answered, you can use the upvote. And when we get to these questions in the discussion session following the presentations, we'll kind of go through and make kind of group questions if they're similar. And following today's event, we will post the recording and the slides on the Tipping Point Series Confetti webpage, so they will be accessible in the future. And so with that, unless there are other questions or housekeeping that needs to be done, I think we can probably get started with introducing our first speaker today. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Euan Nisbet, who is Emeritus Professor in Earth Sciences at the Department of Earth Sciences at Royal Holloway University of London. He has a long record of work on the Archean Earth. His recent research has mainly focused on methane in the modern air, including the role of methane in Arctic and tropical climate change, and the task of assessing the dramatic changes taking place in the present-day atmosphere methane budget. In the late 1980s, he was among the first to recognize the significance of methane hydrates and their potential role in global warming. Until 2021, Nisbet led the MOIA consortium with 14 partner institutions that studied methane across the planet with aircraft and ground field campaigns in Africa, South America, and the Arctic, and monitoring of greenhouse gases at a number of stations from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours, Euan.
I first have to check I'm unmuted, so I hope you can hear me. Just to introduce myself also, as you can probably hear from my accent, I'm African, but with very strong Canadian connections. My family is extremely complicated. And that gives me an interest both in the tropics and in the far north, both of which are important in dealing with methane. So I'm going to share my screen, and this is where everything goes wrong. And let me hope that something happens. And can you all see my screen now?
Yes,
Gabrielle?
I can see it.
You can see my screen. Okay. I now, of course, have a little set of boxes right over my writing, so that's all right. Methane. CH4, for those of you who are not too keen on words like methane, which is also pronounced methane in parts of the world. Very simple chemical. It's just a nice round chemical. Carbon in the middle and a bunch of hydrogens around it. What's interesting, though, is that there are different forms of carbon. Common carbon's carbon-12, that's what we're mostly made of. A little bit of the carbon, sort of 1%, is carbon-13, and that's particularly common in methane from fires and from geological sources like gas wells. And that means when you get methane in the air, you can sort of smell it, because you can say, well, that's the carbon-heavy methane. And so that probably came from a fire or a gas well. And then you backtrack the winds and you say, it came from over there. Or if it's very rich in the carbon-12 methane, you can say, that probably came from some cow, and it's the front end of the cow mostly. It's the breath, though everyone likes to think of the back end of the cow. Back end is important because manure also makes it. So methane is a very, very interesting gas to what are called biogeochemists, because it's the sort of breath of the planet. It's emitted all over the planet by lots of different sources. Many of them are very strongly dependent on climate. In particular, it comes from swamps, rotting vegetation and swamps. And the cow's tummy is pretty much the same as rotting vegetation in a swamp. And so there isn't very much difference between those two. Or if you store carbon for millions of years down there, what comes off is gas, and that's natural gas, and natural gas is mostly methane. So when you put it through your gas boiler or whatever, stuff gets lost, and that's the geological methane, that's carbon heavy. Okay, now let me see if my slides advance properly. Here's where my next problem comes. Right, okay. It's sort of the breath of the planet, and in a way, it's an integrating proxy for the state of the entire global biosphere. Because it tells you about the equator, it tells you about the Arctic, it tells you about all sorts of things going on in the atmosphere. It's a messenger that things are changing in the planet. When methane changes, that tells you the whole planet is changing. There's a bit of a warning here. A lot of my slides are very detailed. Those of you who are detail freaks can see that later. Right now, just sort of look at the pictures or something. This is one of the most beautiful spots in the world. It's a place called Zeppelin, way above a base called New Alcesund, which is in northern Spitsbergen. And you can feel almost that you can reach out and touch the North Pole. And yeah, methane's important up there. If you stand there, you can sniff the air from Siberia. And so you can figure out what's going on in big Siberian gas fields, which is exactly what we're doing here. On the other hand, methane's all over the tropics, big swamps, lots of cows. Now, what's happening in the methane budget? We've been measuring methane carefully, particularly by the American NOAA group, who've done really fantastic work since the 1980s. And initially, if you look on the left-hand side of this plot, there was a curve, very steep rise at the beginning, lots of gasworks going off. Extracting gas is inherently leaky anyway, and the old Soviet Union was extremely leaky. And then in the late 1990s, the growth curve sort of flattens off, and by about 2000, methane in the air wasn't growing anymore. It was way above what it ought to be. Natural methane sort of on that scale on the left, sort of 700s. It had gone up to 1750 or more. That's in part per billion of the atmosphere. But it had reached equilibrium. It's a bit like accelerating on a road in a car. You put your foot flat, and eventually you go so fast that the wind resistance equals how much energy your energy is your car engine is putting in, and so you reach equilibrium. And we thought in the early 2000s that the methane budget had reached equilibrium. And then something happened at the end of 2006, and methane started growing again. And more than that, in about 2013, 2014, the growth accelerated. And then in 2020, it accelerated even further. Now, that sort of curve is not the sort of curve you get from what's called an equilibration curve. An equilibration curve is you getting in a car, putting your foot flat, and eventually you'll equilibrate at whatever speed it is that you're going. That's the maximum your engine can take. No, there's something new coming in here. And that's our problem at the moment. We don't know what that is. Something very strange has happened. There's a reference to a paper down here which discusses this in great detail. Looking at a different map. This is a map of the planet also made by NOAA. If you look at the up and down there, that's the latitude. So the equator in the middle, the line across the middle, North Pole at the top, South Pole at the bottom. But it's actually plotted on the sign of the latitude. The reason for this is that it's proportional to the area of that particular latitude zone. The Arctic's actually fairly teeny. It's right up at the top. And along the bottom here is years. And you'll see that between 2000 and 2006, methane went up some years, down some other years. That's an equilibrium situation. You get El Niños and you get La Niñas and so on. But something kicked in at the end of 2006, a growth curve. And since then, the Southern Hemisphere has grown pretty much continuously. Northern Hemisphere ups and downs, but basically it's grown continuously as well, with particular spikes in 2015, and then something extraordinary taking place in 2020. And this does not appear to be anything to do with COVID, or it's something different. It's a lot of it's coming out of the tropics, and it appears to be biologically driven. I'll talk about that more in a moment. This growth in methane actually is probably the biggest challenge to the Paris Agreement. This is a plot from the UN Global Methane Assessment in 2021, which was one of the underpinnings of what's known as the Global Methane Pledge, where 150 plus countries have decided to try to do something about methane. And you'll notice that the red dashed line there is about what was expected for the Paris Agreement in a typical scenario. And the other gases are plugging along. They're not doing very well, but not awful. Methane is just doing something terrible. Now, partly that's because the Paris Agreement sort of figured nothing was going to happen to methane, so it left it out, really. We just reckoned it wasn't going to do very much. But it is a really, really big challenge to the Paris Agreement. If methane does this, the Paris Agreement fails. Okay, how do we measure methane? We measure it in lots of different places. The best data are for measurements on the ground, taking bottles of air or having an instrument there that measures continuously. Then you measure in aircraft and in drones and so on. And then on top of that, there's satellite work where you can actually retrieve the amount of methane in the air by looking at the reflected sunlight and other ways as well. Two really important stations here. I showed you Spitsbergen, that's the one at the bottom, up in the far, far north, pretty close to the North Pole. The other one I'm going to mention here is Ascension Island, which is right in the middle of the equatorial Atlantic. It's a little bit south of the equator. Has very, very steady winds. And now these plots here, this is the a measure of the amount of heavy carbon, that's carbon-13, in the methane. And what's interesting here is that the amount of carbon-13 in the methane has declined worldwide since about 2006. So not only did methane start growing then, but the amount of methane, the amount of carbon, or the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 had been shifting. And that's an indication that the new sources causing this growth are probably biological. There are other explanations to do with the chemistry of the atmosphere and so on, but this has been sustained for so long, that the only reasonable explanation seems to be that it's biological, that quite a lot of it is in the tropics. And what are the biological sources in the tropics? Well, they're obviously cows. The other really big one, the biggest of all, is wetlands. And if you look at that, the numbers, for example, in that Spitsbergen plot in the bottom, the last couple of years, the plunge has been really striking. And that's actually true of the most recent data from Ascension as well. Something pretty dramatic is going on in the biology of the world, and especially probably in the tropics. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to advance myself now. Okay, so where does the new methane come from? This carbon isotope evidence is strongly suggesting that the biogenic sources, which are swamps, cows, landfills, things like that, even biodigesters. Human emissions, human biological emissions includes cows, cow breath, and cow manure as well, and landfills and sewage works and so on. And they appear to be growing, but relatively linearly, which makes sense. You know, cows have calves, humans' population goes up, human demand for food goes up, and so on. But there's nothing really dramatic happened in 2006. There wasn't a huge jump there. So also, when you add up all the emissions that we think have been happening by using statistics like counting up the cows, it comes here as about 15 teragrams, 15 million tons. That's not enough to account for the changes. As the other possible source of the new methane is wetlands, particularly tropical and subtropical wetlands, which are very widespread in Africa and Amazonia and Southern Asia, Southeast Asia. And also, of course, wetlands in the north, in Canada and Siberia. And there's quite a lot of evidence that the tropical climates are changing. The weather tropics, where the great tropical weather systems extend, they seem to be expanding. And a warmer world is a wetter world. So more rain means more swamps, means warmer swamps, and both warm swamps and big swamps make more methane. Okay, so swamps. The inference is that something quite dramatic is happening in wetlands around the world, especially in the tropics and subtropics, but also in the Arctic. So in the boreal areas, that's Canada and Siberia. Now, African swamps, at least, this is Lukanga swamp in Zambia, not all that far from Lusaka, tend to be absolutely stuffed full of cows as well. You know, where a cow can walk, they'll go. And cows, of course, also eat trees. So African cows are very adventurous creatures. And chemically, you can't really tell the difference between the inside of a cow. A cow is a wetland at 37 degrees. It's just an equatorial wetland, that's all. But what you can do actually is, because tropical wetland plants tend to be rich in C4 plants. These are plants like maize and sugar, and quite a lot of the wetland grasses in the tropics. Papyrus is a good one. And they tend to be rather richer in carbon-13, whereas northern swamps tend to be richer in carbon-12. So again, you can use these carbon isotopes to separate them. You can also use the hydrogen isotopes because the amount of deuterium in the methane is also helpful. And if you look at global total emissions, how they've changed, this is an estimate from Lindsay Lann in NOAA, it looks like probably the majority of the recent growth since 2006 is coming from these natural sources, particularly wetlands. We did some experiments. These are flight campaigns in our Moya project. One particular one over a marvelous swamp in northern Zambia called Bangweulu. It's a fantastic place. It's the headwaters of the Upper Congo River. And we got dead lucky. The plane went over perhaps about the only time you could actually get sunlight through there. It rains all the time. And the wind was absolutely still. If you look at the picture in the top left there, you can see that the cloud is going straight vertical, and the methane is coming straight off it. Now, if you look at the map in the middle, that X pattern is how the plane flew. And it turned out that this swamp, Bangweulu, is making about as much methane as Great Britain. which is a reasonable amount of methane for a swamp to make. Now, if you warm up that swamp and if you rain on it a bit more, and they've had huge rainfall in parts of Central Africa, then the productivity of the swamp is going to increase a lot. Also, if you start farming there or cutting down trees and the runoff comes down into it, you fertilize the swamp. So we don't know how the swamps have been behaving, but it looks like they're increasing. In particular, the papyrus swamps in Africa. We borrowed a plane from the British Antarctic Survey going back to Canada for maintenance, coming up from Antarctica, and flew it with friends from La Paz over Bolivia and Amazonia. And there also, we got enormous amounts of methane coming off. Now, these are one-off experiments, but it certainly looks as if the tropics are producing a great deal more methane, and especially the seasonal outer tropics, which this is 18 degrees south. In Africa, you get the Nile wetlands in South Sudan. They seem to be making a lot more methane. There's quite a lot of satellite evidence. Northern wetlands also. Here's our plane in Finland, or my work in Canada. You can tell the type of methane is a little bit different. So doing a global budget, you can sort of allow for this one having a different signature from the equatorial ones, but it looks like something pretty dramatic's happening. Now, let's put this in the back record. These are historic records. We've got extremely good historic records from ice cores. You can go to Greenland, you can go to Antarctica, take an ice core. Ice cores have got bubbles in them, and then you can get the amount of methane in the air. And the top left diagram goes back to about the year 1150. So it's 1,000 years back. And you'll see that on the right-hand side of the chart up on the top left there is the growth of industrialization and the methane. But if you look at the left-hand side, through medieval times, it was pretty much flat. Methane was there. It was sort of 700 to 750 part per billion. And then suddenly it took off and screamed up to 1900 part per billion. Now look at the lower picture there on the left, and that's just the period since the Industrial Revolution began in Britain in about 1750. And this plot here is the amount of carbon-13 in the methane. And of course, the British started digging up coal, and then everyone added to it by pumping out oil, and then a great deal of gas, and gas is methane. And that was methane that was richer in carbon-13, which puts you upwards on these graphs. And you see the screaming upwards until about the year 2000. And that's primarily because of the use of fossil fuels. But then something happens. And if you look at the bottom left curve there, after about 2006-ish, it comes sharply down again. And that's not fossil fuel releases. That's the biological releases. And that's not a sudden doubling of cow population or something. It's something else. There's something new in the world. Now, let's see if okay. Now, do we have parallels? Yeah, we do have parallels. Unfortunately, here, these are ice core records, and the timing is plotted the other way around. When you plot an ice core, you're going down the ice core. So older is now to the right. And if you look at the ice core records, they're very good from both Greenland and from Antarctica. And over the last 800,000 years or so, we've had some quite dramatic shifts between ice age and non-ice age. And the way you get out, the world has come out of ice ages, and there have been repeated ice ages, many, many of them, is in something called a termination. The ice age has been going on for tens of thousands of years, and then something starts changing, and that may take a few thousand years. And then there's what's called an abrupt phase, bang. And for a few decades, there's really dramatic change. And then it takes a few thousand years for the ice to melt. and, for example, Canada to reappear from under the ice, or Stockholm, or wherever you are. And then the termination is over. And in the termination, which may take several thousand years, there's this abrupt phase in the middle that's just a few decades. And it's in the abrupt phase that the planet's climate just completely reorganizes. And the name for these is terminations. It's nothing to do with movies with Schwarzenegger. It's an old name that dates back to the 1980s. There've been lots of them. There's sudden dramatic changes of the entire global weather system, and that includes both the winds and the ocean circulation. This is more detail on one. I'd like to say thanks Jochen Schmidt of Bern for this. Now here, you're getting younger to the left, remember, and you can see these are two terminations. There's three, termination 5, termination 2, and termination 1. Termination 1 ended about 11,640 years ago, and great bumps in climate. In some cases, areas warmed up by 10 degrees in 10 years. That's fairly extreme, but the planetary climate changes in these abrupt phases in a few decades, though the whole termination, I need to be careful here, takes several thousand years. So it's these sharp climbs as you're going leftwards and getting younger. Now you can model this. Well, sorry, you can summarize here. Here's a set of the last 5 major terminations. And typically the amount of methane in there goes up by several hundred part per billion. In terms of millions of tons, that's anything between 500 and 1,000 million tons. And the growth rate in the atmosphere is several part per billion per year. If you look at what's been happening now, it's pretty comparable. The maximum growth rates are much higher. Now, how much of that is just human beings adding to it? Quite a lot. But even if it's only half, it's still higher. The amount that we've put into the atmosphere that appears to be of biological source is getting up to, say, 300 million tons. So far, we've had 135 part per billion of growth. It's quite comparable. Now, if this is coming from a biological source that's not directly under the control of humans, in other words, it's not cows, then it's probably comparable to parts of one of these terminations. And here's a model on the left, which is a model termination. It's done by Martin Manning in New Zealand. And on the right is a fit to data of what's been going on just now. And it looks awfully similar. That we may be in one of these abrupt phases. In other words, there is a tipping point going on, and that it started at the end of 2006. Well, of course, the full thing has been going on for maybe a century, but that something quite dramatic has happened in the last 15 years, and that we may be in the process of something that's comparable to one of those ice age terminations. In other words, that the Earth's climate may already have started shifting, that methane is telling us that there's a global planetary shift underway. I hope I'm wrong. All I'm saying at the moment really is that you can ask this question, are we in a global climate shift? But there's pretty strong comparison between this. The next number, the terminations number downwards, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The next one's termination 0. We don't know. Are we in termination 0? We don't know. But we can ask the question, and that's scary in its own right. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much.
There you are.
Thank you very much, Euan. That's very interesting, thought-provoking. I'm sure there are more questions. I would like to invite anyone, participants, to use the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen to pose questions. We'll do a Q&A after our next speaker, who is now my pleasure to introduce. So we will now hear from Sara Knox, Assistant Professor Geography at McGill University. Dr. Knox's research investigates how wetland atmospheric exchanges of greenhouse gases, water, and energy fluxes respond to a changing climate and disturbance, and how we can modify wetland management practices for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Dr. Knox's previous research made several important contributions to understanding the climatic role of conserving and restoring wetlands across North America, with a focus on restored peatlands, wetlands in the prairie pothole region of Canada, and tidal wetlands. She is currently involved in several synthesis efforts on the role of wetlands as nature-based climate solutions and wetland methane emissions. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction, and Euan, thank you for the very interesting talk. So I'll be following up on what we just heard and sort of bringing in, and let me share my screen, bringing in different lines of observations and really highlighting the importance of network science in terms of helping us understand these changes in the global methane cycle. Move forward. All right, so we've seen this in our previous talk. So we know that methane in the atmosphere is increasing, right? We're seeing this growing rise of methane in the atmosphere. As was pointed out previously, we know that the global methane budget is currently in disequilibrium, but we also know that these new inputs, all right, and these sources are poorly quantified and poorly understood at this stage. So this is really an active area of study. So here, if we look at the global methane budget, so this is from 2008 to 2017, we have what are the different sources of methane to the atmosphere, right? So it can come from fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, biomass and biofuel burning, wetlands, and other natural emissions. And the primary sink is from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. So based on Euan's talk, right, we know that sort of the accelerating growth sources come in part from agriculture and waste, so from cows, from breathing of cows and their manure, but also from wetlands, right? This rise of methane emissions from wetlands, particularly in the tropics. And we've seen, based on our previous talk here, the importance of network science, right? So I think we've learned a lot about, what's going on in terms of methane, in terms of rising concentrations, and what are, the culprits of this rise. So for example, if we look at NOAA measurements from across the globe, and other sort of similar measurements taken at other locations across the world, right? We've seen this increase in methane concentration, our change in our methane isotopes, right? So our delta 13C of methane here. And as we heard, this is really related to sort of the growth being driven by an increase in emission from microbial sources, particularly from wetland methane emissions. This has allowed us to really help us understand what are the different drivers and sources and sinks. So for example, we've been able to sort of come up with these atmospheric inversion frameworks that combine these measurements of methane concentration and measurements of delta 13C of methane to estimate what are the different sources and sinks. So this was a recent paper in 2022. So this is, again, top-down estimate, reiterating what we just heard, that about 85% of this 2007 post-growth in atmospheric methane is due to microbial sources, right? So if we look here at this inversion, and if we incorporate both concentrations and the isotopic signature of methane, we really see that a lot of this change is driven by this increase in microbial sources, and that most of it is coming from the tropics. So from, about 23.5 degrees north to 23.5 degrees south, right? So this is really the value of some of these observations, allowing us to make these sort of top-down inversion estimates of, what is driving these different sources. We can also leverage satellite observations. So using the greenhouse gas observing satellite observations here, this other study again found that about half of the increases in emissions here were coming from Africa, and particularly driven by these wetland methane emissions, but also that we see the signal in high latitudes. So in Canada and Alaska, that this is driven by the temperature sensitivity of boreal wetland methane emissions. right? So these different types of observations, these existing networks have allowed us to gain new insights into what are the factors that are driving this increase in atmospheric methane. We also know that, all right, so these are sort of using what we see in the atmosphere and these networks of concentration estimates or isotopic measurements taken across the globe. But what about methane flux observations? So we know that measurements of methane fluxes from wetlands are relatively sparse, particularly across the tropics and notably in Africa. But there have been an increasing number of in situ flux observations across the globe that are allowing us to come up with different ways of knowing and providing different insights into what is causing this increase in methane emissions and methane concentrations in the atmosphere. So some of the work that we've been doing is compiling in situ observations of methane fluxes. And so in this case here, we're focusing on ecosystem scale greenhouse gas measurements of methane. And this is conducted using the eddy covariance approach. And so a standard eddy covariance site, it might differ in how tall these towers are and where you're making your measurements and what type of ecosystem that you're measuring it from. But it's conducted by here we were able to directly measure the net exchange of methane between the surface and the atmosphere. And we do this by simultaneously measuring turbulent fluctuations in wind and our greenhouse gas, here in our case, methane. And this allows us to directly measure the exchange of methane between the surface and the atmosphere. And thanks to sort of advances in sensor development, we've been able to increase the number of observations across the globe. And so some of the work that we've been doing is compiling this global database of eddy covariance methane flux measurements. There's also other ways of making direct measurements, right? For example, you could take chambers. So they can either be continuous chamber measurements or you can sort of do manual measurements and sort of basically put a chamber over the soil and measure the amount of methane coming out of your ecosystem. But in our case here, we were focused on ecosystem scale or eddy covariance measurements. And we compiled sort of the first global database. It includes 81 sites, primarily in wetland environments. This is a curated data set that's publicly available. And so we've been using this global database to look at regional and answer regional and global questions related to methane cycling. And so what have we learned from this network of in situ observations, right? How does it help us inform these trends in methane emissions that we see? So we've leveraged observations. So this one example is looking at what is methane emissions from rice, right? Can this be one of the drivers of this increase in atmospheric methane? So what we did is we took eddy covariance observations of methane across rice paddies across the globe. We developed a machine learning model to predict methane fluxes using this eddy covariance data. And what we found was that if we sort of scale this across monsoon Asia, that rice paddy methane emissions are about 26 teragrams of methane per year during 2001 to 2015. But what we saw was that paddy rice methane emissions across monsoon Asia actually declined from 2007 through 2015. And this was driven in part by a decrease in paddy rice area, and then also in terms of a decrease in methane emissions per unit area. So if we think about rice paddies in monsoon Asia, they're not likely to have contributed to the renewed growth of atmospheric methane in this recent period. So this is just one example of how we can use other types of observations to inform our understanding of the global methane budget. Similarly, we use chamber observations and coupled it with eddy covariance data to upscale and analyze 2 decades of boreal Arctic wetland methane emissions. And so this is really sort of an unprecedented compilation of eddy covariance and chamber measurements. And again, we came up with a data-driven or an upscaled product. And this was generated using machine learning or causality-guided machine learning model. And using this model, what we saw was a robust increasing trend in methane across the boreal Arctic region over this time period. So here, if we look from 2002 to 2021, we see this rising trend, right? This signal that Euan alluded to as well, but from our maps or from our model estimates derived from these flux tower observations. We also see strong interannual variability, but overall there's a sort of rising trend in methane emissions from the boreal Arctic region. And the majority of these emission increases occurred in early summer, so in June and July. And they were primarily driven by warming. So this is this here that we can see here, right? This temperature is driving most of this increase, but it's also in part driven by changes in ecosystem productivity. But really sort of this climate feedback, right? If we have warming temperatures, we can have rising methane emissions. In 2016, which was an incredibly warm year, had the largest recorded annual methane emission over the region. And this was primarily driven by methane emissions from the Western Siberian lowlands. But again, sort of this climate signal of warming, warming climate, increasing methane emissions. So that was sort of thinking about leveraging, these observations at regional scales. Using the global database, we also came up with a data-driven global wetland methane estimate. And these types of estimates help provide sort of an independent estimate of wetland methane emissions that we can compare against either bottom-up biogeochemical model estimates or sort of top-down inversion estimates. So in this case here, we used 119 site years of data to train a random forest model across wetlands globally. Allowing us to come up with a globally gridded map of wetland methane emissions. And we see highest fluxes in wetland complexes. So for example, the Hudson Bay lowland and across, our tropical regions here. Not too surprisingly, if we look at, where methane measurements are primarily made and where they aren't, we see though that the highest uncertainty is going to come from the monsoon tropics. So where we have the highest methane emissions, they're also the most uncertain from this, data-driven bottom-up estimate using flux tower observation. But again, this type of data-driven product allows us to come up with an independent estimate of global wetland methane emissions. And if we compare this to the Global Carbon Project, either bottom-up, so these would be, model estimates versus top-down estimates, we can see that at the global scale, there's relatively good agreement between the different modeling approaches. But if we look here across the tropics, we see that there's that this globally gridded machine learning model tends to sort of underpredict wetland emissions from the tropics, again, which isn't too surprising given the sparse coverage of data that we have in this region. And also is in part driven due to the fact that the sites that we have there tend to be relatively low methane emitting sites, showing that we're really not capturing sort of this spatial variability in wetland methane emissions across the tropics. So again, if we zoom in on the tropics a little bit more, we can see that this bottom up or machine learning derived product tends to be greater if we look here in the semi-arid regions. But again, in sort of the humid tropical area, we're really under predicting these wetland methane emissions. So even though this map allows us to come up with a new bottom-up estimate of wetland methane emissions, really this limited monitoring of methane emissions from tropical wetlands, I think is really one of our key data gaps at the moment, right? It can, without further observations in this area, it'll be really challenging to sort of better constrain wetland methane emissions across the tropics. To sort of fill in this data gap, one of the things that we've been doing is trying to increase the number of tropical observations. And so we're working on expanding this global database of eddy covariance towers. And we've been collaborating with folks across the tropics to try to increase the number of observations globally with really a focus on the tropical regions. So this is a new collaboration that's underway. Just a little plug to this, if you are interested in these observations or making some of these observations, we're still identifying new sites. And we're looking for partners to join and contribute to this second version of the database. So do contact me if you are interested in contributing to this effort further. But I think, there's a lot that we can learn from these networks of observations and direct flux observations across the globe. And they can also help us, right? These provide sort of benchmark frameworks for different types of models. So for example, I talked a little bit about top-down estimates of global wetland methane. There's also, if we look at results from biogeochemical models, again, we see that there's evidence for rising wetland methane emissions. So this is a modeling study that was led by Zheng Zhang, and looking at this recent intensification of wetland methane feedback. So using their model, they're able to show this increase in global wetland methane emissions. So this is driven by two different products, two different meteorological products, this reanalysis-based one and a ground-based estimate, again, showing this increase in global wetland methane emissions and this potential, feedback that we can see. And if we model this out into the future, again, based on our different representative concentration pathways, we see sort of the potential for wetland methane feedbacks to the climate system, again, depending on which scenario we end up following. Again, these models are highlighting here, we're looking at the change in annual total methane emissions relative to sort of the 2000 to 2006 baseline. And we can see that it's increased across the globe, but that there's been quite an increase in the tropical regions, and particularly across the African continent, but that there is sort of a large spread and uncertainty in some of these models. So this is, a single model highlighting the increasing wetland methane emissions. We also see it across here. If we look at multi-model ensembles, again, we see this evidence for rising wetland methane emissions. So this is looking at an ensemble of 16 process-based wetland methane models. Again, showing that we've seen an increase over the last 20 years. And here, if we compare, sort of the last 2010 to 2020 relative to earlier, so 2000 to 2006, we definitely see sort of this step change in wetland methane emissions across these model ensembles. And we can look a little bit at where do these changes stem from. And here they're looking at the change in wetland methane emissions relative to 2006 across different regions. And we can see again, across Africa, North America as well. But we see that there's a lot of spread, particularly in South America, reflecting sort of the uncertainty that we have in these wetland methane models across the globe. So models, again, are another line of evidence, sort of highlighting this increasing wetland contributions to the global methane cycle. But we can leverage observations to help improve and benchmark some of our wetland methane models. So for example, if we go back to the study by Zhang et al., they looked at taking the FluxNet observations of wetland methane emissions and comparing it to the model output and looking at the modeled Q10 coefficient here. So this represents the soil temperature dependency of our net methane flux from the model relative to observations. And we can see that there's relatively good agreement, but they don't sort of agree across all different seasons. Again, highlighting, are the models getting these temperature feedbacks correct? How can we better improve models to really capture these temperature dependencies, so we can leverage observations to help inform and improve biogeochemical models. Similarly, we can look at it looking at model ensemble mean, methane emissions. We're looking at temperature responses and comparing it to observations and this globally gridded product. And again, see that they come up with sort of a similar temperature response. But in sort of high latitudes and cooler climates, models might be sort of overestimating wetland methane emissions. And this, again, has important implications when we're thinking about feedback. So if we're overestimating the temperature response sort of in these high latitudes, maybe we're sort of overestimating the climate feedback of these wetlands. So trying to get better agreement between modeled wetland methane and observations, I think is something that still needs to be worked on further, but also, again, highlighting the fact that we don't have a lot of observations in the tropics and these warmer temperatures. So, how well can we constrain these temperature relationships? We will need more observations from sort of lower latitude or warmer tropical sites. We know that wetland methane emissions are very complex. So again, leveraging this global eddy covariance database, we can look at sort of this hysteresis response between temperature and methane flux. So if we look at daily methane flux here on the y-axis and temperature on the x-axis, we can see that there's sort of this hysteresis here where the response to temperature is different in the early part of the year relative to the latter part of the year. A lot of models, when they sort of come up with their temperature dependencies, they're relatively sort of simplistic, right? We're not really accounting for sort of this complexity here. So by doing a modeling exercise where we looked at different models, so different either regression-based models or sort of machine learning models, we can see that model performance or bias decreases as we account for sort of the more complex nuances. So models that took into account sort of these site-specific temperature dependencies or year-to-year specific temperature dependencies tended to outperform models that were sort of more general. So I think this highlights that, you know, the accuracy of methane emission estimates improves when we better represent large wetland site variability caused by these different varying environmental factors. So I think this, you know, reinforces the need to parameterize factors other than this temperature and methane relationship. And, you know, it might be important for models to mechanistically represent methane biogeochemistry because of sort of these time-specific, site-specific methane temperature dependencies, right? We can't parameterize these everywhere all of the time. And so this sort of motivates the need for models to better mechanistically represent things like methanogenesis or the production, methanotrophy, or the consumption of methane or methane transport within these models if we're going to get, you know, be able to better simulate these climate feedbacks. Just wrapping up here, again, we can use observations to provide constraints on our different wetland models. So this could be bottom up, so biogeochemical models, or top down inversion models. Again, this is the global methane model that we have here, and we can see that, you know, there's large discrepancies between these different modeling approaches. So can we use observations to, you know, reduce this model spread? So in this case here, what we did is we leveraged our flux tower observations, the FluxNet database, as sort of a constraint to these different bottom up and top down models. So here, this was in the International Land Model Benchmarking Scheme, right? Ranking these different models based on how they agree with site level data. And then we can see, you know, can we better predict or reconcile top down and bottom up estimates if we use, you know, some of the top performing models. So here, if we use our observational constraint, that's the FluxNet site level data, we can see that as we use sort of the top ranked models, that although the spread in our bottom up and our top down models shrinks, the discrepancy between the two, or the difference between the two, right, that spread doesn't shrink further. Similarly, if we use sort of the machine learning constraint, the UpMet product that I talked about, again, we see that sort of the range in the bottom up and the top down models shrinks as we sort of use the models that perform you know, better based on this benchmarking scheme. But again, we see that there still remains that spread. So some sensitivity analysis, you know, highlights that this model performance ranking is subject to our benchmark selection due to sort of this large intersite variability. Again, this highlights the importance of having more benchmark sites across the globe to really capture these diverse environmental conditions. So I'll just wrap up here since I'm approaching the end of my time. But again, I think, you know, observation networks, we've learned a lot about the global methane budget through these different observation networks. You know, we have the tools and the knowledge to help constrain and, you know, better understand the global methane budget, but there's a lot of gaps remaining within our networks, particularly these large location biases provide barriers to help us better understanding global fluxes. But I think, you know, as we increase the number of observations across the globe and we really bring together, you know, folks conducting the observations with the modeling community, we can, you know, better constrain the global methane budget and better understand what's going on in our atmosphere and how methane is going to respond to a change in climate. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah, for this talk. I think these are very complementary presentations, and we've had a number of questions already coming in from the Q&A, and just want to remind everyone who's listening today to please put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll work to get to as many as possible. Also, the slides and a recording of this presentation will be posted on the Tipping Points Confetti site, so make sure you're registered there and you check that for this information, because I was scrambling to take notes as you were presenting, and lots of literature to read, lots of excellent new science coming out. So I do want to start, though, just for clarification, both these talks, and today we're very focused on natural methane emission sources, but just for clarification, we can't let the human anthropogenic sources off the hook entirely. So if you could each just give a couple sentences explaining what we know about human emissions in particular. I know that satellites are showing that we are underestimating some fossil fuel emissions in certain domains. If you could just speak to that, and just how that fits into this overall picture of what we're seeing in terms of methane trends. So Euan, do you want to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. Human emissions, they're the problem. Well, first of all, I should say the problem is carbon dioxide. Don't let that off the hook. But methane's been pretty important, depending on which way you count it. In many ways, half as important as CO2 over the last couple of centuries, or even more in some ways. The amount of methane in the air is very, very roughly 60-40 nowadays, 60% from human activities and 40% from natural. And that 60% from human activities is a lot of it's from the fossil fuel industry, gas and coal. A lot of it is from our tinklings with biology, which is our food. And so people depend on this, but it's cattle. It's not just cattle, cattle and sheep and goats. It's also landfills. It's where our food goes, where our sewage goes. And the biodigesters too, they're pretty leaky. There are lots of different sources. So the human part of the methane budget is the majority. And if we do something about the human part, we're really going to bring it down. And because methane's lifetime in the air depends on how you count it, well, one way of counting is a bit over 9 years. If we stop the emissions, then it comes down. And it's simple, stop emitting it. There was a famous British Prime Minister who once said, didn't really take his own advance, once you're in a hole, stop digging. It's the simplest way out. Stop emitting. Okay, over to you, Sarah.
Yes, and I'll reiterate that it's not that anthropogenic emissions aren't important; they are. But if we're focusing on sort of the increase, right? We gotta see where that rise and increase is coming from, and I think that points to the biogenic sources.
Nature is coming back here and telling us something scary.
But that's not to say that we shouldn't reduce emissions, right? That's
So I think this gets to, part of what Euan was showing in terms of, we have the actual concentration and we also have the rate of growth, and this idea that the anthropogenic emissions essentially got to this equilibrium where we're keeping the added and the sinks aren't keeping up. But now we've got this other source. So, and then just to pick up on that a little bit more, just in terms of some of the detection opportunities and measurements. Sarah, your presentation was fantastic in terms of showing all the various networks for observations and compiling and interpreting that with different types of modeling and data approaches. So just to reiterate, you cover this both in your talks, but if you could just highlight the 3 highest gaps that we have currently in our methane budgets, and the key tools that we need to close those. I know you cover those in the talks, but just if you could reiterate those in three high level points, starting with you, Sarah.
Yeah, I think, right. One of them is where do we make our observations? And I think, we have a high bias towards sort of the northern hemisphere. But I think, we need to make observations across the globe, particularly if we're, thinking about what's causing the rise in atmospheric methane. If that's coming from the tropics, how do we ensure that we increase coverage across the tropical regions, but doing it, in an equitable and sort of inclusive way as well. And so I think that's sort of a key gap and something that can help constrain. I think there's bringing together different fields. So observations with modeling, various types of modeling. So bringing us all into sort of the room together to make sure that we can reconcile these differences between top-down and bottom-up estimates. And yeah, I mean, I think, other types of observations too, right? Leveraging sort of whether it's, remote sensing estimates. So I think that's somewhere we can improve as well, as observations from space, getting a global coverage, but also aircraft observations. So I think better linking these different types of observations across different scales and really focusing in on the underrepresented regions, I think is important.
Euan, your view?
Okay, do you want me to come in here? I fully agree with that. I have several real things on my wish list. One of the things we were happiest with in our big Moya project, which was a big UK project, was the work done by the University of Botswana and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in the UK in setting up measurement in Okavango. With this tremendous help from Mangaliso Gondwe in Botswana. And we really need more measurement in wetlands in both Africa and South America, and that those measurements should actually include low flights, either by aircraft or UAVs, drones, at a couple 100 meters. So a lot of the methane goes straight up the papyrus. So that's one thing. Far better tropical measurement. There's far too little tropical measurement. The next thing I mention is we need much better monitoring. We depend entirely on the NOAA network with a few other people like us who sort of add on bits and drabs of data. And we have too little measurement in the tropics. There are very few stations in the tropics. One place I've been very long concerned about is Ascension Island, which is sort of the equivalent of Mauna Loa, but it's in the equatorial Atlantic. It's an incredibly good place to measure, and where you can measure in 3 dimensions up to, say, 3,000 meters, so you can get the breadth of the Congo and of Amazonia. Places like that. So more steady measuring. Monitoring is boring. Politicians don't pay for it, but it's essential. It's what made the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty work. It's also what made the Montreal Treaty, the Ozone Treaty, work, which is the best thing we've ever done for the greenhouse, let alone the ozone hole. And that was verified. Trust but verify, said Ronald Reagan. Now, finally, and here I think there is really good action, is in the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry is trying very hard to actually measure its emissions. And recently, for example, John Kerry went to Turkmenistan and came to an agreement there. You can spot the big emissions with satellites. The industry can find their emissions. In many cases, they can either stop the emissions or else actually remove the methane if it's high. We've done a lot of that in oil and gas, and some of the really big gas fields like Qatar are pretty clean. What we have not done very much about is coal. And the coal industry in China and India really needs to think about its venting. And in South Africa and Australia too, other places where they're deep coal mines. And there are huge emissions coming off here, poorly known, poorly understood, and they really need to be looked at. Finally, what shocked us flying over Africa is the amount of crop waste fires. There are fires everywhere in Africa. We actually, I was in a plane that had the biggest bump of the career for the pilot. Fortunately, it was upwards and not downwards. We went over what we thought was a little fire, and suddenly, many thousand feet upwards, we had bits of trees hitting the cockpit. And this is a 4-engine jet. It was very dramatic. These fires are big, even though they look little. And there's no, they kill enormous numbers of people. There's interesting recent studies, for instance, by Drew Schindel, suggesting that they stop precipitation. They're really damaging. Crop waste fires need to be stopped right around the world. Firstly in India, where they're a huge cause of air pollution, but all over Africa. We can do other things. We can turn them into energy. We stop them in Europe. They can be stopped. That's doable.
Thanks for both of those, adding additional dimensions to this discussion and the presentation, in particular on how natural sources are in addition to these large anthropogenic sources. So I don't want to lose track of that. And so, because we had a number of questions talking about lifestyle choices and how those are affecting those emissions, and they are going up because of human consumption. But what we're focusing on here is this additional apparent feedback in the natural system to the warming that's being driven by anthropogenic emissions. And so on that, I do want to ask, in this, we have essentially these inventories for human emissions. What is needed as we project forward in our different scenarios for climate change and mitigation and adaptation? How can we improve the way these types of natural methane feedbacks are included in our modeling? So this includes the TIP-MIP model intercomparison process. And Sara, you spoke a lot about the different types of models and these benchmarking and machine learning models, and in addition to these kind of need for, in addition to process-based, but also mechanistic and the spatial and temporal variability that we have. So is there an effort going on right now to define future natural emission scenarios that could be utilized to give us greater understanding of how future warming and natural emissions will affect our mitigation policy needs and adaptation needs? Sara, starting with you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think as we saw in some of the modeling slides, there's a lot of uncertainty coming from the different biogeochemical models for thinking about sort of bottom up estimates, at least on the natural side. There is a lot of uncertainty and large error bars and large spatial variability. So I think there is ongoing work in trying to refine and assess these models, and there's different model intercomparison activities. So I think that's sort of one area where there is ongoing work that can be done and that will be done, and I think that can at least help better disentangle sort of the natural component of these sort of future projections, right? So I'm not saying that as we sort of move forward and we forecast these out into the future, we got to make sure that we can get that natural feedback part right, so that we can really disentangle what is sort of the anthropogenic component to it. And by sort of getting the natural sources better, then we can sort of better understand methane in the future and how our own actions to reduce methane are going to play out in the future, right? Because if we can't sort of tackle this runaway feedback, it's hard to sort of track how changes to anthropogenic methane emissions are going to play out in the future.
Thanks, Sara. And yeah, so I'm actually going to, and I'm putting Euan on the spot with that termination model that he's using. Are those the types of, could those tools be used? We have to define a scenario. What are the constraints? Those are based on going from glacial Earth to interglacial. Now we're outside of that box. Are there, how much trust do we have in being able to extrapolate those trends? Are there geographic or other limits to how much wetlands can expand?
I think we're pretty much in open territory. The geological examples are much further back. There's some pretty good ones, but they're a long way back. And some fairly catastrophic things have happened in the Earth system. I'm thinking of 55 million years ago, which I did a bit of work on as well, where the Earth just went crazy for 125,000 years, which is rather longer than we hang around. Put it back down to fine detail. I mentioned in my talk our flights over Bangweulu in northern Zambia. What really surprised us was that the emissions were so different from the various models that would predict what the emissions were. The models were basically wrong. And I think that's the models, particularly for tropical wetlands and for seasonal tropical wetlands in the outer tropics, do need a lot of re-examination and recalibration by actually going and measuring in tropical wetlands. And measuring in at altitude at a couple 100 meters, so that you get what actually comes up the stalks of the plants, and you look at the trees as well around them. So I think we need much better information there. On a more general point, though, I was corrected in Washington. We had a meeting a while ago because I said the inventories in the tropical countries are very poor. And I was told, no, nowadays there's a great agreement to actually do decent inventories. Our experience is that the inventory data from most of the tropics is actually not at all good. In some countries in the north, there's been a great deal of effort to measure emissions. In terms of the global cost of climate change, it's trivial. It's a very, very small cost. And we've got a lot of satellite observation to match to it. And I think we need a much, much better effort to produce both human emission and natural emission inventories for every country on the planet. Now, previously, incredibly poor countries like Singapore were exempted because they were too poor. And I think that should change. One of our friends, Crispin Tickell, was one of the godfathers of what's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which I think is something quite magnificent. Everybody signed up to that. We may have argued about some of the other things, but we all signed up to that. And it's something where we all need to get together and produce really good inventories for every country on the world, including the Vatican. They all need it. And it isn't a big effort.
And this is where I think, Sarah, some of the modeling comparison and the observations, what you're talking about, these are fairly key to being able to do that well. So there are 3 topics that have been coming up that I want to cover in the 15 minutes we have left. So I'm going to give you the 3 so you can fit them all in. So Sarah, given your background, there is a question that this actually, I've had this come up before. Wetland restoration. What do we need to know in terms of net carbon impacts, both CO2 and methane, given that wetlands are a source of methane, but also important as a carbon sink? So that's the first question. If you could help resolve how we should think about that. The second question is, here we've been talking almost entirely about sources. What do we need to know about sinks in the atmosphere or other, and how those are changing? And third, there was a teaser in the title, what about hydrates? Neither of you have talked about that yet. I think, Euan, you alluded to it, what happened 55 million years ago. But there, yeah, if we can cover those 3 topics in the 15 minutes left, who wants to start? I guess, Sarah, let's start with you on how we should be thinking about wetland restoration.
Yeah, it's something that I think a lot about. What is this sort of push and pull of wetlands are really good for storing CO2, right? They have high carbon sequestration capacity, but they also emit methane. I think what's really important when we think about wetland restoration and conservation is, what is the alternative? So for example, even though peatlands, if we're thinking about development or draining, peatlands across Canada where I am, even though restoring peatlands might increase methane slightly, if you drain those peatlands, right, and you expose those organic rich soils to oxygen, the amount of CO2 that they release is really large, right? So it's what is that comparison to the baseline or the alternative? So a lot of the work that we've done is, we've shown that, even though restored wetlands might, they do emit methane, but they also store carbon. But if you compare that to the alternative of draining these peatlands and allowing all of that stored carbon to go back to the atmosphere, that's really overwhelms the signal a lot more than the methane emissions that you get from these restored sites. So it's when you compare the restored wetlands to sort of the alternative land use type, which is spewing a lot of CO2 back out to the atmosphere, even though you might have minor methane emissions from the restored sites, it's far better than draining these peatlands and re-releasing that stored carbon back out to the atmosphere. So it's comparing it to alternative scenarios. So I think that's where we win, right? Is if we were to drain these wetlands and re-release that carbon back out to the atmosphere, that has a much more negative impact on the climate than the restored wetlands themselves. And also thinking about it over time, right? These wetlands store a lot of carbon, but they do it over long, long time periods. Whereas methane is a relatively short-lived greenhouse gas. So the benefits from wetlands and wetland restoration, you really see over long time periods. So keeping these systems as wetlands over long time periods, I think that's where we gain as well. And Euan, I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead if you have.
Can I come in briefly here on Africa? Because I was lucky enough to go overland over Africa in 1971. And in many ways, Africa now has more wetland because the rainfall has increased in large areas of Central Africa. But back in the last century, there was a plan to dig through the Sud, which is the Nile wetlands. And of course, South Sudan at the moment has terrible flooding. That's the sort of obvious thing that somebody would say, let's do that. Now, but the trouble is, if you do that, what happens next is the peat burns. And you get very rapid restoration of CO2 into the atmosphere in huge quantities. So basically, don't tinker with the wetlands. I'm biased, I love wetlands. It links across, though, into a discussion that's increasing in the northern world about rewilding. And here we have the problem that if you rewild, you take away the food production, say in England or somewhere. And where does your food, because you've still got to feed people in England, where does their food come from? Well, they could get a bit thinner, I could do that. But their food will come from the general global market. And eventually that means somewhere in Brazil or somewhere in the Congo, somebody will cut down a bit of forest. And so when you start rewilding, then you have the problem that you're going to shift the entire planet somewhere because we have a global food market. And so somebody will cut down a bit of forest and it'll probably be far less efficient than your original potato patch in Scotland. So there's a problem there. Secondly, I have close Indian relatives. I'm African. I'm well aware how central cattle are in culture and religion in many parts of the world. If you are going to do something about climate, you need everyone to support you. And that means everyone has to understand why we're doing these things. And there are a lot of easier things to do than get rid of all the cows. And the very first thing I do is shovel some soil on the landfills in many big tropical cities. You know, the easy things to do the easy stuff.
So yeah, stop digging first, use the hole deeper, and then use some of that soil on the wetlands, on the landfills.
On the landfills, yeah.
So very quickly, do we want to say a few words about sinks? And then I would like to use the remaining time to talk about hydrates and this idea of the main topic at the top, essentially feedbacks. Are we, what is the prediction for future natural emissions? When do we know, when will the potential feedback on temperature be detectable or emergent? What are the predictions there? But first, I don't know, Euan, do you want to talk about sinks very briefly?
Okay, I'll just briefly mention sinks. The sinks are, obviously, if you have equilibrium, sinks equal sources. And the big sink is OH. If you think of water as HOH, H2O, knock off one of the H's by some reactions in the atmosphere involving ozone, you're left with OH. And that's the cleanup of the atmosphere. And if that changes, and it does change in things like the El Nino cycle and something called the Indian Ocean dipole, and you get these big ups and downs in it. But there's no really strong evidence for really sustained change for 15 years that we've had. That's part of the natural system of the atmosphere. It's linked up with how much water. There's a sink, the chlorine in the atmosphere. And there are people suggesting that maybe we could put some salt in the atmosphere and that would change the chlorine. Possibly. You've got to be very careful with geoengineering because what you change for one person, you might not change for the better for somebody else. And then a sink I love, which is soil methanotrophy, soil bacteria. And actually, in some termites make methane. Some termite nests, a lot of the methane is taken up by these bacteria that just eat it on the way up, because methane is food. But the sinks do change, but there's no evidence that they're changing dramatically, except in response to the amount of methane in the air. As methane goes up, the sinks change. It's a bit like wind resistance, and when you drive a car, as you drive faster, of course, there's more resistance.
Thanks. Just Sarah, did you want to add to that, or can I add a little nugget to that?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add to that. Go for it.
Yeah. So thanks, Ian. That's very quickly. So this, what Ian's mentioning is that the more methane you have, it's going to compete for that hydroxyl radical, that OH, which means there's less of the OH, the lifetime of methane goes up. So there's this additional feature. Conversely, if we are able to cut methane fast enough, there'll be more OH and the lifetime will decrease. So there's this extra benefit to reducing methane emissions. But I will say that as we talk about a hydrogen economy and as hydrogen leaks, that adds to that competition. And so there is a potential risk of hydrogen, if it is leaky, to extend the lifetime of methane, and an additional thing that we should be keeping an eye on. And with that, yeah, sorry.
We did quite a lot of work on that a while ago, both hydrogen and, of course, carbon monoxide. And they're quite scary. Running into a hydrogen economy is a scary thing if you don't know what you're doing. It may lead to an awful lot more problems.
Yes, we need to be eyes wide open. I think just going back to the previous conversation in terms of recognizing interconnectedness in these natural systems and our human systems, and how we can shift effects. So I know that there are a lot of folks who want to hear about hydrates and other feedbacks. So first, Euan, can you give us a quick update on where we are thinking with hydrates? And then we'll close it out with this larger, how we know what's going on in terms of feedbacks, what our predictions are, what we think, where are we going on methane emissions? All right, so Euan, hydrates.
Okay, well, methane forms an ice with water called methane hydrate, which stores a huge amount of methane, and it's present in the Arctic, very widely in permafrost as well. It's stabilized by pressure and temperature. And back in the 1980s, I really got quite worried about this. I was chairing a Canadian committee on national hazards, and we realized that there was an awful lot of hydrate in Canadian territory, and things were getting warmer. If you make it warmer, the gas comes off. We found lots of plumes off Spitsbergen. Luckily, we then discovered that the underwater methane, it's for complicated reasons, it has to be at 250, 300 meters depth. That's where the pressure stabilizes it. As the bubbles come up, they get taken up in the water, either by bacteria or by dissolution. The methane that comes up through permafrost goes up through soil, and there again, our lovely methane-eating bacteria will eat it. Now, there are plenty of places where that doesn't happen, where the hydrate comes out bang. And in the past, there's parts of the Arctic that look like they've got chickenpox, they've got pockmarks. Perhaps luckily, we found some of the biggest reservoirs and pumped them out. They're called gas fields. And they're not going to explode anymore because we've burnt them and turned them into electricity. Now, there's another problem there, but that's... we have partners in Spitsbergen. Our lab gets flasks from Spitsbergen and in Alert, northern Canada. And we're looking at the Arctic quite carefully. At the moment, although there are probably burps of this, the growth in the methane in the world tends to be led from the tropics and the subtropics. There are periods when, yes, there is stuff happening in the Arctic. But I think at the moment, our big problems are in the tropics. There's also Antarctica, where there's less monitoring. There are some stations there. At the moment, it doesn't look like the Antarctic hydrates are coming out, but we need to watch those as well. So it's a fear on the horizon at the moment.
Thank you for that, bringing us up to speed on that. Sara, closing us out, feedbacks, all the modeling, machine learning, mechanistic, process-based, improving observations. How is this all helping us understand and project future feedbacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the more observations we have, the better models we have, the better we're able to sort of forecast what's going to happen into the future. I mean, I think we're already starting to see, sort of rising trends in sort of natural biogenic sources of methane. it depends a little bit on what temperatures do and precipitation regimes, how they all change. I think there's the potential to see sort of this increasing positive feedback. Again, it'll depend a little bit on which pathway we sort of choose. But I do think that, models are starting to pick up these signals, observations are picking up these signals, and, with more observations, we can better predict, we can refine our models, and, make sure that we're accurately forecasting what's happening in the future, to help, inform what are some different, management or some different, RCP pathways that, which trajectory do we want to go on, make sure that our modeling supports those, and that we're, accurately forecasting what's going on into the future.
Excellent. Thank you both. I think that we need to wrap up here. Couple of key takeaways just to echo off what you're saying, Sara. Our carbon budgets assume certain things about future human methane emissions and assume that we don't have a rising natural methane emissions. So if anyone's tracking the global carbon budget, this is a really important caveat to have in mind. We are, as Euan showed an early slide, methane is something we cannot afford to ignore as we think about our future mitigation and adaptation pathways. Other takeaways that I heard loud and clear: need for more and better measurements, especially in the tropics. There are large gaps in those regions that affect our understanding, and that includes the importance of monitoring. I worked a lot in the Montreal Protocol space, absolutely essential. And the types of models and this ability to reconcile the observations with these types of models and the value of these kind of networked research and scientific endeavors. So with that, I really sent a heartfelt thank you to our speakers. Lots of information. I will probably be watching this again and looking at the slides. I do want to give a round of applause to our speakers. So I'm going to do the sound one. Thank you so much. These were excellent excellent presentations. Tried to get to as many questions. There are a lot of great ones in the Q&A. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get to all of them. Thank you for all to everyone's attention and participation today. Our next event will look into the economics of climate tipping points, and the link should be in the chat. Thank you, Caroline, and other upcoming events. Thank you again so much. I learned a lot. I don't know if I'm going to sleep better tonight, probably not, but this is, we need to know these things. So again, thank you to everyone and for your time and attention.